Shalom. Welcome back to Understanding the World with Rabbi David Kaufman, and I'm joined in the studio by Mark Finkelstein, the Jewish Community Relations Director of the Jewish Federation of Greater Des Moines. And we were talking about the boycott, divestment, sanctions event at Brooklyn College before the break. And Mark, I'll let you continue where you were.
Thank you. You know, Brooklyn College is a public college in New York City funded by public funds. The issue seems not to be whether controversial topics can be debated on campus. They certainly can. The question has to do about the nature of the controversy. In this particular case, the Brooklyn College Political Science Department decided to sponsor a one-sided discussion whose attempt was to censor Israeli academics in the United States. And we've seen across the world, for example, instances where Israeli academics and other officials have been disrupted to begin with. And in this particular case at Brooklyn College, it seems to be the case that the Jewish students who were in the audience who wanted to see what was going on and perhaps to respond via questions were ejected from the audience itself. Now, underlying this is one of the speakers, I believe his name is Omar Barghouti, had written a book claiming all the worst demonization of Israel. So the question that was brought up recently in the media is, if you have somebody that really delegitimizes and demonizes the state of Israel, that basically constitutes anti-Semitism, according to the definition of Natan Sharansky, which is, I think, has been really accepted. So the question to the political science department is, how do you feel, essentially, after having sponsored something that demonized and delegitimized Israel?
Well, the simple question is, why do we allow on campus now things that are basically not only bashing Israel, but bashing Jews? It's fairly clear that we would not allow programs on campus that would bash any other minority. In fact, there would be rioting on campus if they tried to do those programs. But you can have a program. Let me just describe what happened at Brooklyn College here, because Brooklyn College is actually launching an inquiry into what happened. I'm gonna read from an article here. Last week, the Hillel students told Tablet magazine they were simply holding anti-BDS information sheets on their laps. But college officials alleged they were talking throughout the panel and distributing anti-BDS pamphlets to other students. Okay, first of all, there's nothing wrong with distributing anti-BDS pamphlets to other students. Okay, so that's already an issue. There shouldn't be any problem doing that as a free speech issue on campus.
Disruptive of the speech.
Well, yeah, I mean, if they're standing up in the middle of the speech and throwing paper airplanes with BDS information, I can understand that. But if they're if they're distributing the information in an appropriate way, that's a whole other thing. Meanwhile, Melanie Goldberg, one of the students who had been ousted, held her ground. She said, "We're not taking the slander to our names lightly, nor do we feel that the college had any right to evict us." She said that the college, the administration had yet to contact any of the students who were removed, and they were not aware of the investigation. Another student aired his frustrations about being ejected from the event in a New York Daily News op-ed. The investigation, it seems, may have also been initiated as part of a response to a statement released online earlier this week in which Hillel director Nadia Drucker called the BDS event decidedly non-academic and very confrontation-oriented. We're united in the belief that an investigation must ensue immediately regarding the difficulty of students easily identified as Jewish to enter the BDS event, and others as witnessed by the Dean of Student Life to be asked and then forced by security guards to leave. A few pro-Israel students also claimed that they had been turned away at the door, even though they each said they had received an email confirmation of a reserved spot. What seems to have been the case is that this group decided that they didn't want pro-Israel people there, and therefore they thought that the Jews would be pro-Israel and therefore didn't want Jews there. And if that's the case, we're dealing with something that is anti-Semitic, flat out.
Yeah.
What we see around the country is that most of these programs are exactly that. Most of them are not discussions of whether or not boycott, divestment, and sanctions work. Most of them are simply bash Israel programs, and the people that these organizations bring in, like Omar Barghouti, are very much in that vein. They're not, let's talk about whether or not we want to have Ahava products on campus. They're, let's talk about whether or not we want to have anything to do with Israel. And that's, and how bad Israel is and how awful the Jews are who support Israel, which is the vast majority of Jews. So
if indeed this was really a very stilted discussion, essentially, the question goes back to the political science department, what its responsibility is in co-sponsoring student events to begin with. The free speech issue has been brought up, and some of the people we know said it's free speech for the political science department to sponsor or not co-sponsor any program it so desires. But when and if this investigation substantiates the claim that this was not an academically reasonable program, question then goes back to the department to see what its statement would be.
Yeah, it seems to me that you have an issue of political science departments being able to do basically whatever they want under the guise of free speech.
That's to begin with.
That's the first issue.
But that issue then is related to the integrity of the programs that they do sponsor, and that should have some bearing on what they will or can or cannot sponsor.
Yeah, and I think the university needs to say that it's not okay to bring forth people who spout hatred, and it doesn't matter whether it's a great deal for the political science department, a great deal for the program that's going to bring attention to the university, like Columbia University bringing Ahmadinejad to speak. Hatred is hatred, and you can't say, oh, there are just a few Jews here, therefore it's okay, and you cannot say, oh, a few Jews think it's okay to bring this person in, even though the vast majority think that it's horrific.
Let me add a different wrinkle to it, because there was a different case I had been involved with many years ago where an administrator said, if you try to protest against this, then your speakers will be protested against, because somebody would say that my speakers promote hatred as well. So hatred is a subjective issue. The question has to do with academic fairness rather than simply the characterization of hatred per se, perhaps.
Well, it's true that the universities are simply not bringing in pro-Israel people to speak when they're bringing in the opposition, and we see that in universities in Iowa too. It's not just anywhere else. Part of that may be that some of the anti-Israel speakers are partly funded by other organizations that have plenty of funding, and therefore they're cheaper to bring in than the pro-Israel speakers. That's entirely possible. It's certainly the case that there are fewer leading speakers pro-Israel, that they come from Washington, D.C. or New York, or they come from Israel, or they come from England, and they're more expensive to bring in. But that shouldn't be a legitimate reason, especially at this day and age where we could have people come in over the internet from anywhere and speak.
That's right.
And they'd be perfectly happy to do that.
Just as a tag to this, over the number of years, 5, 10, 15 years, a number of pro-Israeli speakers have literally been disrupted. And there were different tactics taken by those who were disrupted. I think Michael Oren, basically, who was disrupted 1 year, said, look, as a college, you have invited me as a guest into your home. I should be able to speak, and I will thank you for quieting down and let me finish my presentation. That didn't work. and other cases where simply the programs had been disrupted by a systematic fashion of one speaker standing up, or somebody in the audience standing up, and his friend next to him then standing up and spouting off something. And this basically, that's an act of anti-university code of ethics.
Yeah, and universities need to get to the point where they're going to stand up and say that that's not okay.
Okay, that's part of it. The other thing is, just because something does occur on campus, it does not obviate the need of university senates or presidents to stand up and tell what they believe about the speaker. In other words, the Senate can censure, not censor a speaker, and that's been done successfully in different places as well. And just last word on this, there was something in England last week where a pro-Israeli speaker was disrupted, and the university knew about this ahead of time and did not do anything about it. So it's a complex topic. It's insidious in terms of what the university will or will not tolerate according to its own codes, and we have a lot of work to do on that issue.
Yeah, well, it's definitely the case in some places that the university administrators are in favor of the protest.
Well, that may be.
Or just don't want to put up with opposing the protesters, because some of the protesters are very vocal and they'll cry Islamophobia and they'll cry all kinds of other things.
Which brings us back to your point.
Which brings us back to the original point.
Yes.
My friend Ishmael Kaldi, a Bedouin Muslim Israeli diplomat, gets protested everywhere he goes. He tells me that he's in England right now. He gets protested in England all the time. The reality is there are Muslims who support the Israeli government. There are Muslims who believe that the Islamists and what the Islamists try to put forward is bad for Muslims. My friend Zuhdi Jasser would argue that the Islamists who are pushing for Sharia law and overcoming secularism and secular law and freedom and liberty and all of those things, that is a bad thing. So the idea that universities are going to take a stand against people who are speaking in favor of Israel or Muslims who are speaking in favor of secular ideas is really problematic. I mean, how do you have an academic dialogue if anybody who's speaking against the standard accepted point of view is shouted out of the room? Didn't we endure this stuff with Galileo? I mean,
right.
This stuff went out a long time ago, where you have somebody who argues against the prevailing point of view is shouted out of the room. I mean, and this is what's going on college campuses.
Right. May I change the topic?
Sure.
Okay. Another topic has to do with what's perceived as a softer American foreign policy. What do you know about that, David?
Well, we talked about in my introduction this issue of John Kerry and Chuck Hagel's positions regarding the Arab world. And you had Defense Secretary Hagel speaking Wednesday and telling a group of Pentagon officials that the U.S. can't dictate to the world, we must engage the world. Hagel said, we must lead with our allies. No nation as great as America is can do any of this alone. We have great power, and how we apply our power is particularly important, and engagement in the world should be done wisely. And the resources that we employ on behalf of our country and our allies should always be applied wisely. Okay, so what does that mean? We've got John Kerry saying that Iran is a country with a government that was elected and that sits in the United Nations. And it's important to us to deal with nation states in a way that acts in the best interest of all of us in the world. He added that Iran knows what to do. The president has made clear his determination to implement his policy that Iran will not have a nuclear weapon.
What do you make of...
How do you get to the elected, that Iran has an elected government when we were protesting the fact that we know for a fact that those weren't fair and
those
unbiased
elections
were
rigged, and we're talking about a highly repressive government nonetheless. What do you make of this attitude that all we need to do, in contrast to the Bush administration, is to cooperate with other people and go out of our way to hear their demands?
Well, look, let's talk about the fact that not everybody agrees with what we believe, first of all. And, when somebody says you can, in order for me to work with you, you need to compromise with me. And what they're asking you to compromise are your basic principles. Now, for me, I judge people whether or not they stand up for their principles. And guess what? The rest of the world judges the United States based on whether or not it stands up for what it believes in. When we say we are in support of democracy and we're in support of women's rights and things like that, we cannot then turn around and support governments that violate those things. And we're doing exactly that. We absolutely are in a position right now in which we're finding ourselves being asked to give up our principles because multiculturalism essentially is preferable. So when the other cultures say it's okay in our culture for women to not be allowed to drive or vote or any number of other things, you just need to accept that. It's okay for us to oppress religious minorities in our country, Christians and Jews or whoever, because that's what our culture says. That, as far as I understand American ideals to be, those violate American principles. And we simply cannot just accept that a culture hates people and wants to restrict liberties based on anything, whether it's religious ideas or anything else. We need to say, if you want to be an ally of the United States, you need to do these things. You need to support democracy. You need to support freedom of speech. You need to support women's rights. You need to support minority rights. If you can't do those things, we will limit our support or eliminate our support of your government. End of story.
Well, the contrasting viewpoint, do we have enough?
We'll have to talk about it after the break.
Okay.
So let's take a break. When we'll get back from our break, we'll talk about all of that.